Before we start today's video, I should make it very clear that it's going to be a little bit different from the previous worth playing in 2020 videos. If you're here only to hear my final thoughts on the game, then make sure to skip to this part of the video where I summarize my experience with it, but if you want to keep watching, then here we go. So if you're unaware, at the start of the year I made a video about Final Fantasy IX and if it's still worth playing this year for the first time. I soon followed that up with another video for Final Fantasy VII. Safe to say that the plan was to make 3 of these videos, one for each of the big 3 from the PlayStation 1 era, that being Final Fantasy VII, 8 and 9. And that brings us to today, where I finished playing Final Fantasy 8, but the difference this time was that I played it for the first time ever. With the previous 2 videos, I was revisiting games that I've played before, but here I only had speculations and bits of information I heard over the years, like how there's a scaling system and the infamous junction system that apparently is a major love or hate relationship. So basically what I'm saying is that this video should be called What It's Like to Play Final Fantasy 8 in 2020 for the first time, but that title was really long and it probably wouldn't get as many views as I would want, so we'll keep the same name as we have been so far. So as someone who never got to experience Final Fantasy 8 back in the day, just imagine the excitement on my face when in June 2019, the remaster got announced with a release date for September 3rd. I even went out my way to pre-order it for that sweet, sweet theme. And now here I am, in August 2020, finally getting to talk about it because it took me 11 months to play it. FF8 was a game that intrigued me from the day I got introduced to its main character Squall in Dissidia on the PSP. Later followed by his appearance in Kingdom Hearts, I really wanted to find out more about him, but there was no opportunity for me to play the game as I didn't own a PlayStation 1. So when the time came and I started playing for the first time ever, my initial reaction was, what the fuck is happening? I literally sat through about 5 minutes of black and white pictures that made me more confused than anything, but then to top that off, it got followed up by one of the best openings in all Final Fantasy games, so it's safe to say the hype train was back. And so I went on to play the game and something weird happened. I wasn't having fun. The game was constantly stressing me out with its extremely long tutorials that did more damage than help. The junction system was confusing. I kept stressing anytime I would earn XP because I heard apparently that's a bad thing in this game. And every time I went online to look for help or guides, it seemed like people were 5 levels below me, but their stats and their setups were like they were ready for the final boss. Not only was I stressing myself out, but also getting worried that maybe this game just isn't for me and all those expectations I had were pretty much pointless. But that's when something clicked. I decided to play the game without any guides, no walkthroughs, no discussions online, no tutorials on YouTube, and told myself if I mess up, I'll just learn from it, and that's when everything changed. I started to enjoy the game. I wasn't comparing myself to guys online, but rather celebrating any time I learned something new. It didn't matter if it was on disc 1 or disc 3, I was engaged and just experimental. I started trying new things just to see the results, and I didn't care how good other people were at the game. And it was the best feeling for me every time I was able to take advantage of something because I figured it out myself. Okay, so with that little backstory out of the way now, let's move to the side. Let's talk about what it's actually like to play this game for the first time, and to do that let's start with the basics of Final Fantasy VIII. You'll be playing as Squall, a cool but quiet teen that has a major problem when it comes to expressing feelings out loud, but he's also a member of the Seed, which is basically a military force that's raised and trained in a facility called the Garden. You take control of Squall just before his test to make him an official Seed member, and within that time frame you get to meet some of his fellow classmates and future party members for the future events to come. These Seed members get sent out on missions and get paid for how well they perform, and this is actually something that happens throughout the game. The higher your Seed rank, the more of an income you receive every now and then. This works instead of you earning money the usual way of defeating enemies, and I actually really liked that. It was a nice change and it was cool to see. You even got to do these little exams if you wanted to, where you just answer questions about the game, and if you got 100% you would get promoted to the next rank, and obviously that would just mean you earn more money. But its military feel of the world and story is very strong throughout the entire playthrough. There's many sections where you'll receive orders and have to follow them through. I was really surprised at how well this worked at times with you feeling like a real soldier, and I'm happy to say that the game didn't move away from this after the opening act. Of course, you get introduced to the main villain of the story, who this time is a evil sorceress that has taken over the world by being announced as the new ambassador. She's got her own army building up, and you get the gist of where this is going. It's typical Final Fantasy stuff. Big main villain, getting more powerful, great evil. You're chosen to stop her, things aren't as easy as they seem on, you think you defeat her, but oh wait, there's a plot twist, and that's not to say it's a bad thing, but we know how these games work. Now this isn't me bashing on the game, but rather trying to say as little as possible because I personally really enjoyed the story in this one, but if I were to go into the details, this review would be a literal spoiler field and I don't want that for anyone. Just know that where the story goes, there are so many epic battles taking place and some reveals that you will just not see coming, but they work and fit really well with the main plot. And a little extra thing I can say is that on top of the story, there's also this side plot, which is the romance between 2 of our main cast members, and coming from someone whose favourite Final Fantasy is number 10, I definitely appreciate that side of the story, and everything it did to help us understand and get better insight on Squall as a character. For anyone out there who absolutely adored the cast in FF7 or 9, I wouldn't necessarily put the cast of 8 on that level, but as far as the main lead goes, I can imagine putting Squall pretty high up on my list. But again, that's just my opinion and I know many people might disagree with that. Okay, so if you've ever searched up anything like what's the best Final Fantasy game, or which game to play first, or anything like that, nearly every ranking will have anything from Final Fantasy 6 to 10 at the top of the list, usually taking all 3 spots whilst they're at it. But another thing you might also notice is that the most inconsistent ranking will usually come from FF8. To me, it always seemed like the dark sheep of the more classic Final Fantasy games. It's like the FF13 of the 90s. You know, it did it before it was cool and all that. You do get the occasional lovers of the game, but the most common criticism is how it tried doing too much after the success of FF7, and in turn that resulted in it being one of the most complex JRPGs when it comes to gameplay because of its junction system. This is that part of the video where I'm going to get most of the negatives about the game out of the way, so if you're planning to play the game, listen up, and if you're someone who's played it before, then let me know if you agree or disagree with any of this. But to start off with, the combat in this game is tedious. I mentioned before how you don't necessarily want to level up because the enemies level scale with yours and you can make the game much harder than it needs to be. Well, despite that, you still need to take part in fights and random encounters to use the draw command. This is your one and only way of gaining magic in the game. You draw different magics from different enemies and add them to your stock. Sometimes you get lucky and get 9 of them, but sometimes your luck will suck and you barely get any or just straight up fail. You need to do these magics for 2 reasons. First of all, to use them in battle against enemies like you normally would in any JRPG, and the second and probably more important reason is to increase your stats, but I'll get into that in a minute. Next up for combat, you have the GFs, also known as the Guardian Forces. These aren't a negative feature on their own, rather they're really good actually, and they help you a lot, but they just add up to the total confusion of the junction system. You see, considering you're not looking to level up, how are you meant to increase your stats, right? Well, that's what the GFs are for. You're going to be equipping them to your cast and they allow you to boost your stats by equipping the magic you stocked up from previous fights, so the more or the stronger magic you have stored up, the bigger your boost will be. You also level up your Guardian Forces, which means not only are their summons stronger and they deal more damage, but you also unlock new abilities such as a strength or HP boost, as well as more areas to insert your stock magic with things like attack speed or elemental damage and defense. Now if you're hearing all of this and you're literally like, what the fuck is this? I have no idea what this guy's on about. Don't worry, I'm the one that wrote this and I'm struggling myself to read along right now. Okay, so we know the junction system is fairly complex and it takes a lot of time to figure out. You really want to get the right combination for your party members, right? Then imagine you spend about 10 minutes editing your party, only for a cutscene to happen, and now you have to use the other 3 party members that you didn't equip any sort of GFs or magic to. Meaning it's time to reshuffle all the hard work you just did, even if it's only to allow you to use commands like magic or draw. Now to be fair, this is mostly an issue on disc 1 and maybe the early disc 2 of the game, where you didn't have as many Guardian Forces available. By the time you're on late disc 2 and disc 3, you have way more to choose from, and it's safe to say every party member can easily have at least one. But still, it's definitely something that's going to piss you off because the junction system isn't easy and it does take a little while to get the right combinations done. And lastly, what some would consider a negative thing is gaining new weapons. Unlike most RPGs in general, or Final Fantasies for the matter, you don't just buy weapons, because of course not. Instead, you find weapon magazines throughout the world where they have recipes for new weapons and what items you need to synchronize them. Now I'm going to make it clear, I don't think this is an issue on its own. I think it works really well in many games that use the same format. However, in those games you gain the parts you need by defeating enemies, which takes me back to the point of not wanting to level up. So instead, the best method to gain these parts is by using a card command you can only learn from one Guardian Force. This allows you to turn monsters into a card, which you can then convert into a material, which is a really cool idea, but I just want to make it clear, the game does not tell you about this. It's so unique and so clever, but realistically, you could literally play the entire game without realizing this or without upgrading your weapons at all, because you would just assume you haven't encountered the right enemies for the parts, or you'd be too scared to fight enemies because then you level up. But I think that wraps up most of the big negatives about the game. Again, like I said, it's not necessarily game breaking, it's just frustrating throughout your playthrough. And it will just piss you off why some of these things have to be so complex. So I'm sorry if it was a bit confusing to you, but I'm also very impressed if you fully understood anything I just said. What you might have noticed though is that pretty much every single one of those points are all related to the same topic of the junction system and its complexity. At no point did I say I hate the junction system or that I think it's stupid, because it really isn't. The system is actually really intriguing when you get to figure it out mostly, and it's also very rewarding. You can make your party members feel OP or set them to make the game more challenging. You're essentially in charge of the difficulty of the game at any point. It's just a matter of getting to that point that a lot of people might not be willing to put the effort in. So if you're someone who's looking for a simple JRPG to kick back to, then I'm sorry to break it to you, but this game is not for you at all. Okay, that's the negatives, it's out of the way, it's gone now, but I want to move on from the junction system for a bit and focus on the other major parts of the game, most of which I find to be really good. Starting with the soundtrack, which, in all 3 videos about these classic Final Fantasy games, I mentioned how I loved the soundtracks, and that's the same case here, but I'll even say that I would consider this to be just slightly behind FF7, but ahead of FF9 for me personally. With this soundtrack, I found out there wasn't as many major standouts as 7 had, but overall, it was difficult to find a song that I disliked. There were honestly a few occasions where I would just wander around the town just to listen to the soundtrack for a little bit longer, and after thinking on it a little bit, when looking at the entire Final Fantasy franchise, I would put 8's soundtrack in the top 5 most likely. That just shows how much I appreciated and enjoyed listening to it from my entire playthrough. Next up, we got the visuals. Now, before anyone says that the port or the remake looks shit because the background images are pretty much 144p, I agree. But when you compare the way this game looks to FF7, you would not have guessed that the games are 2 years apart. You cannot tell me that. If you've managed to put up with the graphics of FF7, then this game looks like Mona Lisa. The details on enemies and characters in the remaster are actually really good. And also, I don't care what anyone says, even though it's far from perfect, the navigation in this game is so much easier and just way less stressful than the other 2, because it seemed like it was clearer what areas can or cannot be accessed. And when you consider Square actually lost the source code for this game, then I'll say it's a pretty good job. And to quickly add on top of that, the CGI cutscenes I saw whilst playing honestly blew me away, and I cannot stress that enough. I was not expecting to see this many of them, and to the level that they were. There were literally times when I couldn't believe what I'm seeing, not necessarily because of the quality, but just the pure amount of it that the game just keeps throwing at you. And sometimes you even had these CGI cutscenes happening in the background whilst you're doing something else, which I found so impressive. Again, considering this game is from 1999, it's pretty mad. And the last major highlight has to be the story, and I won't go into the detail. Like I said before, I don't even want to spend too much time on this section, but all I want to say is that it's definitely a story I'm gonna remember. It had a lot of good overall moments, and a constant progression throughout the playthrough was one of my biggest reasons I kept wanting to go back and keep playing every single day. Whenever I felt like I wanted a short break from it, I would just play a few rounds of Triple Triad, which, even though I was horrible at the game, I can still appreciate how good it was and how addicting it was. But as soon as I was finished losing every single card I ever owned, I would just hop back into the story and carry on like nothing ever happened. It's safe to say that once it was all over, I was so glad I stuck around to see the story come to a close, and the expectations I set myself all them years ago were honestly fulfilled. Okay, so this is the final bit of the video, so if you're joining us after skipping the entire thing, hi, welcome. Look, I don't want to make this video longer than I should be, but I do want to close it off properly. Final Fantasy VIII exceeded the expectations I had for it. After ignoring all the video guides and tutorials out there, the more I played and experienced myself, the more I loved everything it had to offer. The junction system and its complexity grew on me the same way the materia system did in FF7, and the soundtrack was enjoyable throughout the entire playthrough just like FF9. Looking back, I'm so glad I played all 3 of these classic games this year, and I can definitely say this one is still worth playing 100% in 2020, and I think for me personally, FF8 was the one I enjoyed the most out of playing all of them. And what I think might be the biggest reason for it is that this game might be the most unique Final Fantasy game as far as main entry single player games go in the entire series. It took a lot of risks, and some of them might have not paid out fully, I'm well aware of that, but I'm glad there's a game out there in this franchise that will always stick out to me as that rebel child that didn't want to be like everyone else. So all I'm saying is, don't let opinions online throw you off. If you're looking for a different JRPG experience that's gonna make you really think about what you're doing, with many different things to offer and distract you with along the way, then FF8 might be that game for you. As always guys, you know I appreciate the support. A like on the video would be awesome, or maybe a subscribe if you're new, that's always amazing. It's pretty wild I actually get to put out these videos and have people interact and voice their opinions online. Reading the comments after a few days is always so rewarding, and it's probably one of the most fun parts of making these videos. Especially when I start seeing some similar faces pop up every other video, that's always a cool thing to see. If you're someone new though, and maybe you haven't seen my content before, then make sure to check out some of my other videos. Maybe the other 2 worth playing in 2020 videos, or my most recent Persona 4 Golden video, which I was actually really happy with. That one was a bit more chill and casual. Also, if there's any type of content you guys want to see from me in the future, make sure to let me know down below. I've got some other stuff planned for videos that I want to make, but it'll be really cool to see if you guys have any suggestions as well. These review-ish type of videos do take a bit of time since I have to play the entire game first, so maybe in the near future I might do a few videos that are a little bit faster to make. But anyways, I will shut up for now. Thanks so much for watching guys, stay safe, and I will hopefully see you in the next one.